So what about this custom velocity that I just mentioned that we want to combine this velocity with? This is here on the right side. Let's look at our create V area. And first you will see this object merge that references something from the area heli explosion. Let's click on this arrow, go in there and see what this is. This is my explosion velocity. Let me put visibility flag on it so that we don't see anything else in the viewport. And what this is we will create an actual pyro burst source that will guide the explosion of the front of the helicopter. And I'm creating it in a different geometry node, affects heli explosion, because, well, as the name says, this is related to the explosion of the simulation. So let's go to the first frame where explosion is going to happen, 1431. Let's zoom onto our helicopter. And we are unpacking our helicopter. We are removing the rotor so that we have only the body of the helicopter left, and then I'm extracting the centroid. Let me template the original helicopter. We have the centroid of it. I'm trying to create a procedural setup so that I don't need to put a point somewhere manually straight ahead. I'm just creating a procedural extraction of the centroid. Then I move it to the front. Here is this point. Because no matter where in space this helicopter is going to end up, this point is going to be here. Because for us, it's moving pretty much straight in Z direction. Let me go back to our frame 1431. That's where everything starts. So we have this point in the front, and we use this point as the source for our pyro burst source node. We just say that the explosion will start at 1432, and we use pyro burst source node to show this is the explosion that is going to happen in the first 2 frames, actually 3 frames, and then the explosion is gone. Okay, and this is something that we will use to drive the velocity of this front part that is braking. So let's go back to our FX Heli RBD. Let me template our helicopter, and we have our explosion here. And you will, if I visualize my velocity, this pyro burst source comes with velocity attribute. Very handy, we will use that to drive the pieces. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a switch where only for 1 frame after the start of the solver, this velocity is going to take effect. It makes sense because for the first frame of the start plus 1 frame after, these are the only 2 frames where we actually read anything from here. The rest, the simulation takes over. So here, what I'm doing is I'm doing a simple attribute transfer. And in this, let me just visualize what is going on there so that you can see. In this attribute transfer, I am transferring the velocity of the explosion onto the helicopter. What you see right now is the out-of-the-box velocity of the helicopter that is moving forward. Let's go 1 frame back. This is when our explosion velocity is transferred onto our helicopter. And we are adjusting this velocity here. I'm actually multiplying it by 1.7 so that the explosion is pretty violent and pieces are flying off with a great speed. And I'm also adding some noise. Let me bypass it and show you there is some noise that is applied to this velocity. And this noise will be very helpful to us later when we want to create a lot of wedges for our helicopter, when we want to create many variations of the simulation. Still, the front is going to be flying off, but it will be flying off in a little bit of different direction so that then we can choose which of those simulations we like more. You can see this bypass node. We'll get to it later when we start wedging things. Right now, here the seed of this noise is changed manually. Okay, so we take this velocity, we transfer it onto the helicopter. That's where we view this velocity. And after that, the only thing we're doing is we're promoting the front rotor and rear rotor groups. Let me just visualize them. from our primitives onto points, and we need that so that later inside the solver we can control the slowing down of the rotors. Remember, I promised you that this is something that you will have full control in the simulation. And those groups need to be point groups, otherwise inside the RBD solver they will not be read correctly. So this is done. After that, we are almost there. We are almost at the solver. Let's just check our collisions before we move on. We have our building number 1 that has proper names. We have our building number 2, which has those holes, but it is really not a proper convex geometry. So I'm using convex decomposition to create proper geo from it. And we have our building number 3 here. Let me view everything through the camera. We're merging the 3 buildings, and we are doing an RBD configure so that now everything has proper name. And this RBD configure is set to 0. It means these are non-active objects, but doesn't really matter because I'm using them in the collider's input. They're going to be treated by default as non-active anyway, unless I change that. And here I can control how the geometry representation is set. I had a few options where I treated them as boxes. We can also have convex house because we already set proper convex decomposition. It's up to you. Test and see if you have any pieces that fall into here or any pieces that fall between the decoration on top. If you do, then better switch it to convex hull so you have those proper collisions. Now is the most interesting part. Let's go dive into our RBD solver and let's see what we got here. First, I really love this feature that we have on the bullet solver where we can increase the bullet world scale. Please note that every time you do that, the behavior of your simulation will change. But when you have a lot of really small pieces, this really helps. So if you are doing an RBD sim and you have a bunch of small pieces that are interpenetrating, behaving weird, the collisions are not being computed properly, this is your best friend. Increase this bullet world scale. Then you will see that from the defaults, another thing that I changed is the constraint iteration. Because this constraint iteration is not only constraints and as we think of them, trying to zoom in, this constraints that we see here as colored lines, the constraint iterations also helps us with the collision during the solve. So every time I increase this number, it means that there will be more thinking done by the solver every time the collisions are computed. And in my case, I had some pieces that were interpenetrating when they were forced, when they were colliding with the great force, and that's why I increased constraint iterations. Let me go back and view things through my camera. Then let's go to the properties. And you can see here I have collision padding that is tremendously reduced. What this collision padding is you saw this parameter before. It is actually when you have your proxy geometry, when the solver creates a representation of your proxy geometry, it creates a little bit of a padding around it. And this is how much of the padding we want. You will remember we actually overrode this parameter on most of our pieces. And this means that if it is overridden in RBD configure, let me just go and show you. In this RBD configure, this collision padding, if it is set here, it means that this is what the solver is going to read instead of reading this number. But I like to set it here as well to something rather small for this scene, just in case there is some piece that we forgot or we did not add all the groups. We have this set here as well. Then let's go and check our collisions. There are a few things that were changed, that in our collision geometry, the bounds were changed. We don't want we don't want the pieces to bounce off, for example, the buildings. And the same for the ground. We reduced the bounds of the pieces on the ground. Let's look at our forces. And remember, I told you before that when doing several iterations, I've noticed that when the helicopter falls on the ground, there was an issue where it looked rather light, and I wanted it to look pretty substantial and heavy when it falls. And that's actually a trick that I use quite often when I increase the gravity in my simulations. Very often, if I want to have a car hit or a plane hit, I increase the gravity here. And I'm also adding a little bit of a drag spin because we have pieces flying off with tremendous force at the beginning, so it's good to prevent them from spinning like crazy, like too crazy. Then we have our constraints, and in our constraints we have a bunch of soft constraints on the body of the helicopter, remember? And here I'm setting a parameter that after the soft constraints are at 5 centimeters between the points, after they reach this distance, they are broken. I'm deleting these constraints. Okay, and then on the right side here, we have our body front and the tail pieces. Remember how we set up earlier our timer and our old school hard-coded plasticity? This is here. I'm not going in the detail. It is in the previous videos. If you want, go rewatch them. Dive inside, and I promised you that I will give you manual control over when the rotor blades are stopping. So here are our two groups that we created on our proxy geometry. We already had them, but we had to promote them onto points. These are our front rotor and rear rotor. And what I'm doing is I'm saying that when the frame is higher than 1460 and when the rotors are less than 1 meter above the ground, it means they're already on the ground, they fell, then I'm increasing the friction progressively. Actually, I need to delete this second semicolon. And with that, what is going to happen is the rotors are going to start slowing down when they hit the ground. So let's imagine you have another shot, you get some comments, oh, I want the rotors to start slowing in this frame. Here you have the control. Now let's see how our simulation looks like. First, let's always double check our colliders. Right now, if we go to the visualization tab and you turn on show geometry, what it does, it just takes your whatever you plugged in into the collision geometry and colors it blue. This is not really the representation of the collision geometry. For that, you need to turn on the show collision shape. And after that, we see true colliders through the eyes of the solver. And that's what you always have to do before you start your sim. After that, let's play a few frames. I'm just going to go to frame 1435 and I will allow it to simulate for a moment. This simulation is actually quite fast. It's only the first 2 frames that where we are reading the animation from the geometry. After that, the simulation is pretty fast. The whole sim is maybe 1.5 minutes. Okay, let's take a look. This is exactly what we wanted. We have the helicopter hit at the front. The front part is breaking off and flying off. We can see even one of the blades broke off, but the rest of the helicopter stays the same, and we have a bunch of small pieces which will look really nice when we render this explosion. So this is working. Let me show you how we are going to save it, and then what we are going to do, we're actually going to do maybe 20, 30, as many as you want of those simulations, and we wedge them and we see which one we like most. The way I want to cache it is actually I'm going to cache the points, the fourth output of the RBD bullet solver, and the constraints. I need the constraints because I will use them later to connect our RBD pieces on the deformed metal part. So you can see I have 2 outputs. These are my points of the simulation. Here are my points. I'm going to turn off the velocity. Here are my points. And then I'm merging them with the constraints. And this is what goes into the Heli RBD cache. So here in the geometry file, what is going to happen is I'm going to have several wedges here. So disregard it right now. We'll talk about this path in a moment. But this is what we are going to cache, constraints and the points. After that, what we also need is the original Heli geometry, our beautiful fracture geometry. And you notice I'm actually I'm actually saving it after it runs through the solver, which is not the best way, not the most optimal. The reason here you can see even wrote a note. This is a habit because for a while there was an issue that I noticed where if normally we should cache this geometry after we go through RBD configure, so this is the last step, we know no more changes done afterwards. We should cache from here so that we don't need to compute anything through the solver. But when the geometry was going through the solver during one frame, there was a little offset in the position of the pieces. I believe now this is fixed. And in my case, this was just a little bit of a trade-off. It was extra 10 seconds to run this first frame. So I did it still in this way, but I believe the fix has been done already and it's not an issue anymore. But double check. What you can do is you can go to our first frame of the simulation, 1431. Check what you get when you go to time shift and go to frame 1431, sorry. And if this is exactly the same as what you have as an output of your RBD configure in that frame, then you're good. Then you can connect this wire into the output of your RBD configure and cache it from there. But this is what I've done for this setup. In any case, you have the note here, you know why. And I'm doing exactly the same for the proxies. So now we have our caches, we have our proxies, and then we need to combine them back together into the simulated geometry. And this is the usual workflow. What I do is here's my geostatic at frame 1431, first frame of my simulation. After that, I get the points and I'm running a simple retime on them. Remember, we talked about retime before. We needed this to have subframe data for motion blur. Retime is set to point number because point number does not change in the sim. I can simply use point number. And in this case, linear is good. I did not need to use cubic on the points because these are just points. And on the right side, I have the same points by time shifted to 1431. And after I run it through transform pieces, what I get is the simulation of my helicopter and all the falling pieces. And you can see the blades are still rotating on the ground there. Okay. And after that, remember we cached our constraints as well. I'm bringing them back because in the end, when the helicopter is falling, there are some deformations that are happening to the body. For example, here you can see, and I'm getting some nice dents. Let me bypass it and see originally you see the breaks of the geometry. And with RBD deform pieces, what we get is this nice metal deformation. Okay. And my usual practice is I always repeat the same process on the proxies as well. You can see I have my proxies here. This is my personal tip to you. What I'm doing is I'm removing the small parts because these proxies I'm going to use as colliders later in my explosion, in all the dust, in all the particle simulations. Really, all those tiny small parts. In the case of this shot, on all the shots where the object is quite far from camera, I don't need them. So I'm optimizing my proxies. Let's see, we have 1551 and without it 4926. That's pretty big difference on how many pieces we are deleting. After I did that, I run exactly the same process of the transform pieces, but remember these are my proxies. And then what I'm doing is I'm also grouping the pieces that are in camera. You can see if I zoom out, you can see some pieces are green here. It means they are outside of the camera frustum, and I'm deleting them. Because again, here it is me preparing my collisions out of proxies. Whatever is outside the camera view, I don't care about it. I don't need it for my proxies. After that, I'm unpacking it, and I will use, you can see I have two nulls, one for packed, one for unpacked geometry, in case later I need to use either of those. I'm just preparing those nulls to make my life easier later. And then I am creating volume collisions and geometry collisions out of them. Let's zoom in a little bit. Ooh, it's zooming too much, so it looks like there is some issue with my viewer because I'm seeing some artifacts from the simulation. So let's go labs, reset viewport. press space G so that we can zoom onto the helicopter itself. Okay, now it's better. Here, what I'm doing is, let's look at our explosion again in the beginning. Let's go somewhere here. Let's look at the velocity. Pretty high, isn't it? But doesn't look so bad. Is because here I'm actually clamping the velocity. I am saying if the velocity is higher than 4 meters a second, multiply it by 0.1. Let's look how it looks before that, and let's see how it looks after. This way, when I treat this geometry of the helicopter as a collider in my dusts, I won't have some crazy velocities from the collider that are going to introduce a bunch of weird mushroomy smoke shapes for me. So here you clamp the velocity, and then I have a separate control where I change the velocity of the large pieces. Here I have tail and the inside of the large part. Let's see which ones are those. Here is the part, and what I want here is to actually increase the velocity of this part, because if you notice what happens in our simulation, this helicopter falls on the ground. And it's actually right away I'm gonna tell you, it's not like I sat here and just realized, oh, these are the 25 steps I will have to do further. No, I did some simulations of explosions, and then I came back here, and when I needed colliders of my helicopter to play a role in the explosion simulation, I did these adjustments. So it's always back and forth, back and forth. This took many hours to adjust and go back and forth. So I don't pretend that this is something I just pull out of my head right away and I know this is the right thing to do. No, that was a lot of trial and error. So this body of the helicopter, what I just told you, when it falls down, I'm increasing its velocity. Let me bypass and show you. You see the velocity of the body is increased because if you look at our explosion simulation, you will see that there is some smoke that is being dragged by the helicopter down. And this is achieved by the velocity from the collision. That's why we did that. And after that, as always with all my colliders, I'm introducing a little bit of noise. Otherwise, it's too boring. You see, this is my original velocity. I'm adding a little bit of noise. I always like to add some noise to the velocity of my colliders. And I'm converting it into a VDB because we are going to be dealing with a lot of pyro simulations, dusts, explosions, and for those we need volume collisions, right? This is SDFs. And how we prepare our SDFs is we always call them collision so that we don't need to change them later. We control our resolution through the voxel size, and we create two fields, collision, and we also create a velocity field. So if you look at the information of this VDB from polygons, you have two fields, collision and velocity. Depending on how fast your simulation is working, sometimes it's worth optimizing this velocity field. You can do VDB resample and reduce its resolution. In my case, I actually liked this velocity on some of the smaller pieces, especially when I was working on the fire. But if it is something less detailed, you can always optimize this velocity field. You can see that we're getting some holes here in the geometry, so I'm doing a little bit of reshaping on this SDF. And this is going to be our volume collider. And the nice thing is the whole process of converting this geometry into a volume is pretty fast, so we're not going to cache it. And by not caching it, what we also have is the subframe data, because remember, we have our retime here, which means that if later I run a pyro simulation and I want to have 4 global substeps on this pyro simulation, and I want the colliders to be read 4 times between the frame, I will have this information in my volume collider. And let's take a look how it looks when we visualize it. This is our beautiful volume collision. You can see we have some details and also some noise. Colliders look pretty nice. Let's put the visibility flag on this nothing null and save our file. This is the usual practice. And then I promise to show you how we can create 20, 30, 40, 50 versions of the simulation using PDG and wedging.